"Sir, you need to step away from the aircraft." The voice was young, sharp, and laced with an impatience that grated on the quiet morning air. Arthur Albright, 87 years old, didn't flinch. He continued his slow, circular motion, buffing a small section of the fighter jet's aluminum skin with a soft cloth. The P-86 Sabre jet, a relic of a forgotten war, sat on a concrete plinth just outside the main gate of Creech Air Force Base. It had been his ritual for years. The security guard, a man no older than Arthur's grandson, exchanged a look with his partner. "Did you hear me, old man? This is restricted government property. You can't just be out here rubbing on it." Arthur paused. He let out a slow breath, the cool Nevada air fogging in front of his face. He straightened his tired back, his eyes not on the guards but on the faded lettering just below the cockpit canopy. He could still see the ghost of the name he'd painted there himself, so many decades ago. Carolina Bell. He didn't say a word. His silence was his shield, a habit learned in places far louder and more dangerous than this patch of manicured grass. "License and ID." Now the first guard snapped, stepping closer. His partner, slightly more hesitant, kept a hand near his sidearm. "You're either a vagrant or a vandal, and either way your morning is about to get a lot more complicated." The confrontation brewing under the desert sun was a spectacle in the making. The morning traffic heading onto the base slowed, drivers craning their necks to see the two young, crisp uniformed guards towering over the stooped elderly man in a worn leather jacket. Arthur moved with a deliberate slowness that the guards mistook for senility or defiance. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the cracked leather groaning in protest. The guards tensed, their posture shifting from authoritative to aggressive. "Easy now, Pops," the lead guard warned, his voice dropping an octave. No sudden moves. Arthur's hand emerged not with a weapon, but with a simple, battered leather wallet. It was worn smooth at the edges, the kind of object that had shared a man's life for half a century. He fumbled with the clasp, his knuckles swollen with arthritis. The guard snatched it from his hand impatiently. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered, flipping it open. "Arthur Albright. Well, Arthur, it says here you're 87 years old. Don't you have a porch to be sitting on somewhere?" His partner chuckled. A small crowd of onlookers had started to gather at a respectful distance. A few airmen on their way to morning formation, a couple of civilian contractors waiting for their badges. Whispers rippled through the small group. They all knew the old man. He was a fixture, a silent, unassuming part of the base's landscape, as permanent as the jet he so lovingly tended. They had never seen anyone bother him before. The lead guard, whose name tag read Miller, seemed to relish the attention. He was performing now, asserting his newfound authority. He pulled Arthur's driver's license from its plastic sleeve, holding it up to the light as if it were a forgery. "You live just a few miles from here. What's the deal, Arthur? You get lost on your morning walk." Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the plane. He looked at the spot on the fuselage he had just been polishing, seeing the distorted reflection of the guard's smirking face. He ignored the man's question, his mind not entirely in the present. The scent of the polish, the cool touch of the metal under his cloth, it was a form of prayer, a communion. "He's not listening to you, Miller," the second guard, Evans, said. "Maybe he's not all there." "Oh, I'll make sure he's there," Miller said, his voice hardening. He stepped between Arthur and the plane, blocking his view. It was a calculated act of dominance, a physical interruption of the old man's silent devotion. "I'm talking to you. Show some respect for the uniform." The irony of the statement hung thick in the air. Arthur's eyes finally shifted, not with anger but with a deep, profound weariness. He looked at the young man, at the crisp uniform, at the unearned arrogance. He had seen boys like this before, full of fire and certainty, boys he had flown with, fought for, and buried. "This aircraft is a memorial," Miller lectured, pointing a thumb over his shoulder at the Sabre. "It's not your personal shoeshine stand. By being here, you are disrespecting the memory of the pilots who flew these things." The word struck Arthur with a physical force. Disrespecting their memory. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He had polished this plane through rain and shine, through scorching summers and bitter winters. Every circular motion of his hand was an act of remembrance. Every buffed surface was a story he was keeping alive. He did it not for himself, but for the faces he could no longer see, for the voices he could no longer hear. He did it for Jimmy, his wingman, who never came home. He did it for the Carolina Bell herself, the girl he'd named the plane after, who had waited and then moved on as life demanded. "I think," Arthur said, his voice raspy from disuse, "I have a right to be here." "You think you have a right?" Miller scoffed, taking a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. "You have no rights here except the ones I give you. Right now you have the right to remain silent. because you are being detained for trespassing on a federal installation and refusing to obey the lawful orders of a security officer." He reached for his handcuffs. The metallic click as he unclipped them from his belt was unnaturally loud in the quiet tension. The crowd gasped. Up until now it had been a verbal spat, a minor injustice. Now it was crossing a line. The sight of a frail elderly man about to be shackled for polishing a memorial was too much for some. Phones were coming out, their dark screens aimed at the scene like accusatory eyes. It was Miller's overconfidence that made him careless. As he gestured grandly toward the plane, his hand slapped against the faded artwork on the nose, the very spot where a pin-up girl in a blue dress once smiled. "This is a piece of history, not your personal plaything." The casual, disrespectful contact with the plane did what the insults could not. It broke through Arthur's calm. His breath hitched, and for a split second the sun-bleached concrete of the base entrance dissolved. He was no longer in Nevada. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and sweat. The roar of a dozen Allison J-35 engines filled his ears, a deafening symphony of power. He was 23 years old again, strapped into the cockpit, the stick vibrating in his hand. Next to him on the tarmac, Jimmy was giving him a thumbs up, his grin a flash of white against his sun-darkened face. The Carolina Belle, freshly painted, gleamed under the Korean sun, a promise of luck, a beacon of home. The memory was so vivid, so complete, it was a physical blow. He swayed on his feet, his hand instinctively going to the side of the jet, not to polish it but to steady himself, to touch a piece of his past that was suddenly, terribly real. The flash of memory was gone as quickly as it came, but it left him shaken, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. Unseen by the guards but witnessed by several onlookers, a car had pulled over about 50 yards away. The driver was a man in his late 40s, his hair cut in a severe military style. He wore civilian clothes, but he carried himself like a soldier. He was Master Sergeant Kent, an off-duty aircraft maintenance chief. He had seen the old man at the Sabre jet for years. He knew the quiet ritual. He'd once asked a base historian about it and had been told a little of the story, enough to know that the old man was more than just a local eccentric. Seeing Miller and Evans harassing him, seeing them posture and threaten, filled Kent with a cold, professional fury. This wasn't just poor procedure, it was a desecration. These young guards, puffed up with a little bit of power, had no idea who they were dealing with, no concept of the history they were trampling on. He knew calling their direct supervisor would just bog things down in procedure and paperwork. This situation required a bigger hammer. He pulled out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He had a number on his contact list that few people did, a number reserved for true emergencies. He pressed the call button and listened to it ring once before a crisp professional voice answered. "General Davies's office. This is Master Sergeant Kent," he said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes still locked on the unfolding scene. "I need to speak with the general. It's an emergency." "The general is in a briefing, Sergeant. Can I take a message?" the aide asked, a hint of dismissal in her tone. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you need to get him out of that briefing right now," Kent insisted, his voice hardening. "Tell him it's about Mr. Albright. Tell him security is trying to arrest Colonel Albright at the gate guard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kent could hear the clatter of a keyboard as the aide likely cross-referenced the name. He watched as Miller grabbed Arthur's arm. Kent's grip on his phone tightened. "Tell the general," Kent said, his voice now dangerously quiet, "that they're putting their hands on him, right now." Inside the command building of Creech Air Force Base, Major General Marcus Davies was in the middle of a high-level briefing on drone deployment strategies. He was a man accustomed to the weight of command, his face a mask of stern focus. His aide, a young captain, suddenly appeared at the door, her expression a mixture of panic and resolve. She broke protocol and walked directly to the general's side, leaning in to whisper in his ear. "Sir, Master Sergeant Kent is on the line. It's an emergency at the front gate. He says security is arresting a Colonel Albright." Davies's expression didn't change for a second, but a stillness fell over him. He held up a hand, silencing the major who was speaking. The entire room went quiet. The name Albright was not just a name to him. It was a legend, a piece of Air Force lore. "Colonel Arthur Albright?" Davies asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir," the aide confirmed, her face pale. "At the P-86 display. Kent says they have hands on him." The transformation was instantaneous. The stern strategic commander vanished, replaced by something fiercer. General Davies shot to his feet, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every officer in the room stiffened, their attention snapping to him. "Get my car," Davies commanded, his voice a low growl that filled the room with palpable energy. He grabbed his service cap from the corner of the table. "Now, get me the head of base security on the radio. Tell him to order his men at the front gate to stand down immediately. Tell them if they so much as bruise that man's skin, I will personally end their careers before lunch. Move." His aide scrambled to comply. The general, without another word to the stunned officers in the briefing room, strode out, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. The audience now understood what the guards at the gate did not. The old man wasn't a nuisance to be removed. He was a treasure to be protected. Back at the Sabre jet, Miller was enjoying his moment of triumph. He had successfully intimidated the old man and was now in the process of cuffing him. "All right, let's go, Pops. You've caused enough trouble for one day." He pulled Arthur's arm behind his back, the movement rough and uncaring. The old man grunted in pain, his shoulder protesting the awkward angle. This was the final irrevocable mistake. This was the overreach from which there was no return. The crowd murmured in protest, a collective sound of disapproval. A woman shouted, "He's an old man. Leave him alone." Miller ignored them. "He's a suspect interfering with a military installation," he announced loudly, trying to justify his actions. "This is a matter of base security." He was so focused on his performance, so wrapped up in his own authority, that he didn't hear the approaching sirens until they were almost on top of him. These weren't the familiar yelp of local police. This was the deep, guttural whoop of military police escorts, a black command sedan. The two-star flag of a major general fluttering from its fender, screeched to a halt just feet from the scene. It was followed by two base security trucks which expertly cordoned off the area, their lights flashing. The doors of the lead car flew open and General Davies emerged. He was the very picture of command authority, his uniform immaculate, his face radiating an intensity that made the air crackle. Miller and Evans froze, their mouths slightly agape. They recognized the flag on the car instantly, their entire world tilted on its axis. The general didn't even glance at them. His eyes, burning with a cold fire, were fixed on one person only, Arthur Albright. He strode across the grass with a purpose that scattered the onlookers like startled birds. He stopped directly in front of Arthur, who was still held awkwardly by Miller. "Guard," Davies's voice was like ice. "Release him, now." Miller, fumbling in his shock, immediately let go of Arthur's arm and uncuffed him, his hands trembling. General Davies waited until Arthur was standing free, rubbing his wrist. Then, in a move that stunned every single person watching, the two-star general snapped his heels together and rendered the sharpest, most profound salute of his life. His hand was a blade, slicing the air, stopping just beside his eyebrow. "Colonel Albright," the general said, his voice ringing with a respect that bordered on reverence. "It is an honor to see you, sir. I apologize for the conduct of my men." A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. "Colonel?" The title hung in the air, seeming to change the very quality of the light. Miller and Evans looked like they had been struck by lightning, their faces ashen. Arthur, no longer the stooped, tired old man, seemed to grow in stature. He straightened his back, and though his body was frail, his bearing was unmistakably that of an officer. He returned the salute with a practiced if slightly shaky hand. "At ease, General." General Davies dropped his salute but remained at a position of attention. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, but his words were directed at the two petrified guards. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. He didn't wait for an answer. "You are standing in the presence of Colonel Arthur Albright, a man who flew 142 combat missions over Korea in this exact aircraft. This P-86 Sabre, the Carolina Belle, is not just a memorial, it is his plane." The general took a step closer to the jet, his hand gently touching the fuselage near the faded name. "This man is a triple ace. He shot down 16 enemy MiG fighters, 3 of them in a single day. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for flying his heavily damaged aircraft back to base after his wingman was shot down, refusing to leave the sky until he could guide the rescue helicopters to his friend's position. He was awarded 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and a Purple Heart. With every medal named, Arthur seemed to stand taller. The general's voice rose, filled with a passion that captivated everyone. "This man, this old man you were about to put in chains, is a living legend. He is a part of the history you swore to protect. He doesn't polish this plane because he's a vagrant. He polishes it to honor the memory of the men who didn't come home. He polishes it because he has a right earned in blood and fire that you can't possibly comprehend." The crowd was silent, rapt. The people holding phones were no longer just recording an incident. They were documenting a moment of history. An older man in the crowd, a retired vet himself, wiped a tear from his eye. Having vindicated Arthur, the general's icy gaze finally settled on Miller and Evans. He walked slowly toward them until he was standing inches from Miller's face. "Your names," he said. It wasn't a question. "Miller, sir. Security Officer Miller," the young man stammered, avoiding the general's eyes. "Evans," the other whispered, his voice barely audible. "Miller." "Evans," the general said, the names tasting like poison in his mouth. "You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear. You possess no judgment, no perception, and not an ounce of the respect this man's generation fought and died to preserve. Your gross incompetence and disrespect have not only insulted a national hero, but have embarrassed this entire installation. Report to the security chief's office. Your sidearms will be confiscated, and you will be placed on administrative duty pending a full review of your fitness for service. I can assure you, the outcome of that review is not in question." They stood there, stripped bare by his words, their arrogance shattered into a million pieces. But as they turned to leave in shame, Arthur stepped forward. He placed a gentle hand on the general's arm. "General," Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. "They're young. In their world, threats look different. They see a strange old man. They think they're doing their job. A hard lesson is still a lesson." His grace was a powerful counterpoint to the general's fury. He looked at the two young men, not with anger, but with a flicker of something like pity. "Remember this day. Let it make you better." As Arthur spoke, his hand rested on the nose of the plane, near the faded painting of the Carolina Belle. For a fleeting moment, the scene shifted again. He was not old. He was 23, covered in grease and paint, standing on a makeshift runway in a foreign land. His friend Jimmy was beside him, carefully outlining the blue dress on the pin-up girl. They were laughing, full of the terrifying, beautiful invincibility of youth. "She'll bring us luck, Artie," Jimmy had said, his voice full of hope. "She'll bring us home." Polishing the plane wasn't just about remembering the war, it was about remembering the boy who had said that, and the hope they had shared. In the weeks that followed, the story of Colonel Albright and General Davies became a local legend. The base command acted swiftly. A formal public apology was issued to Colonel Albright. A beautiful new bronze plaque was installed in front of the P-86 Sabre, detailing its complete history and the incredible combat record of its pilot. The plaque ended with the line, "Maintained with honor and devotion by the man who flew her, Colonel Arthur Albright, USAF Regret." General Davies also mandated a new base-wide training program for all personnel, focusing on the history of the base, its most distinguished veterans, and a new protocol for interacting with the public titled the Albright Rule. Miller and Evans were, as the general had promised, permanently reassigned. Their days of patrolling the base were over, replaced by janitorial duties in the base's least visited warehouse. The shame of their public dressing down followed them everywhere. One quiet Tuesday morning, about a month after the incident, Arthur was at his post performing his ritual. The new plaque gleamed in the sun nearby. He heard footsteps on the grass behind him and turned to see a young man in civilian clothes approaching tentatively. It was Miller. He looked different without his uniform, smaller and uncertain. He wasn't smirking anymore. He stopped a few feet away, holding a small bag. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just watched Arthur's slow, steady movements. Finally, he stepped forward and held out the bag. "Sir," he said, the word no longer a formality but a genuine sign of respect. I bought you some new cloths, high-performance microfiber, and a bottle of water. It gets hot out here." Arthur paused his work. He looked at the young man's face, truly looked at him, and saw not the arrogant guard but a kid who had learned a hard lesson. He took the bag. "Thank you, son," he said simply. Miller nodded, seeming unable to find any more words. He just stood there for a moment, watching the old hero polish his warbird. Then, with a final respectful nod, he turned and walked away. A little of his own honor finally restored. Arthur watched him go, then turned back to the Carolina Belle, a fresh cloth in his hand, continuing his vigil under the vast desert sky. The stories of heroes like Arthur Albright are written not just in history books, but in quiet acts of devotion. They walk among us, their valor hidden in plain sight. If this story of courage and respect moved you, please honor their legacy by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Veteran Valor for more.